So I'm Michael Stohl. I'm the director of the Orfalea Center, and I'm pleased to have been a partner in this enterprise for 2 years now. It's been an interesting journey for us, and I'm happy to open the sessions this afternoon with this morning rather, for framing the issues. We have two excellent speakers, and the speakers will each speak for approximately 15 minutes, slightly over, but not long over, is acceptable. And we've agreed that the two presenters will present their papers and will take questions after, so that to maximize the amount of time for questions on both papers. And hopefully there'll be both areas of agreement and what's more fun, areas of disagreement for us to discuss. So let me first introduce Harmonie Toros, a senior lecturer in conflict analysis from the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent, who will speak on counterterrorism versus human security. Harmonie?
Okay, so the main argument that I'm going to make is based on the actual title and the theme of this conference, which is counterterrorism and human security. How do they actually come together, and do they ever come together at all? And scholars and enlightened policymakers have for more than a decade now been seeking this intersection between counterterrorism and human security. The reasoning is that there is a magic point at which counterterrorism and human security logics intersect, a crossroad where we are safe enough and free enough, right? And we had that an example of that in the talk by Sir David Allen this morning. And the very introduction to this conference says it is important to further security through effective human rights promotion, while at the same time recognizing the limitations upon human rights that are sometimes necessary for providing security. So we search for this point, this magic point where they intersect, where we don't have to undermine neither security nor freedom. And I want to argue here that this is more or less a fruitless search. We should really give up on that. And that's because counterterrorism's narrow focus on non-state terrorist violence, a focus that separates this violence from other forms of violence, be they direct or structural, in this logic, counterterrorism will always override any considerations of human security. On the other hand, for those who reject that terrorist violence is the prime threat or one of the prime threats to international security today, and argue for a focus on far deadlier but more silent killers, so inequality, state repression, patriarchy, etc., human security will always override counterterrorism concerns. So this is why this is what people are looking for, but this is why I picture counterterrorism and human security as two parallel logics that never really intersect. And we're put in this really difficult position and this sort of unsavory choice of having to choose and put one above the other. We have to make that political choice, which is essentially a political choice, to decide which is most important to us, because we cannot find this moment, this moment of intersect. So how am I going to do this presentation? So I'm going to first look at how they are presented as potentially intersecting, but actually very little possibility. And then I want to offer an alternative framework through which I think the concerns of counterterrorism and the concerns of human security actually can come together. And that is using a frame of conflict. Instead of looking at terrorism and looking at human security, if we actually start looking and talking about conflict, I think that is more helpful. So from a counterterrorism perspective, although when focusing on counterterrorism, policymakers tend to say little about human security and human rights, there's usually one phrase sort of thrown in there that insists that all measures being put forward have to respect human rights and sometimes ensure human security. So for example, at the EU level, the EU's counterterrorism coordinator, whose name is unpronounceable unless you're Dutch, which I think De Vries, I don't know how to pronounce it, that's the best I can do. He's argued that our policies to combat terrorism must respect the rights and values we have pledged to defend. These are the respect for human life, respect for democratic standards, respect for individual liberty and dignity, and including the rights of prisoners. Theresa May, as Home Secretary but also as PM, has pointed also at the existence of this point of intersection between counterterrorism and human security. In 2014, she said in a speech on counterterrorism, "In an open and free society like ours, we can never entirely eliminate the threat of terrorism, but we must do everything possible, consistent with our values as a country, to reduce the risk presented by our enemies. The government's policy," she added, "our counterterrorism strategy and this legislation," at the time counterterrorism legislation, "all aim to do just that." When she was speaking about the UK pulling out of the European Convention of Human Rights, she said earlier this year, "We can protect human rights ourselves in the way that doesn't jeopardize national security or binds the hands of Parliament." So if we move away from the European framework, we can find a better intersect, was the argument being made by Theresa May. We can be safe but respect our values. We can protect human rights while ensuring national security. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the people who really focus on human security issues, for example, I'll use Human Rights Watch, on its webpage on national security, it urges the US government to bring all national security policies in line with US obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. Similarly, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights insisted on states' obligation to ensure that all counterterrorism measures themselves comply with human rights standards, but at the same time that there's flexibility built into human rights law to deal with exceptional circumstances. So CT has to comply and human rights have to be flexible. I think this is the kind of argument that's put out. So at least in principle, all sides seem to believe that this perfect balance is possible, that there's a point where both logics are respected and fulfilled. The argument I want to make is that both sides are really just paying lip service to the other and essentially believing that their logic overrides the other group's logic, that their concerns are essentially more important and must be given primacy. So let's go back to the same speech of Theresa May. She says, at the time she was Home Secretary, "As Home Secretary, I am responsible for government policy on crime, policing, immigration, and border control. But by far the most important of my responsibilities relates to counterterrorism. This is actually the most intensive and time-consuming part of the job." So this is the Home Secretary of this country saying the most important part of my responsibilities is counterterrorism. It is the most intensive and it is the most time-consuming. That's quite a big statement from a Home Secretary, I would say. And indeed, I'd say most state rhetoric, terrorism is separated out from other threats to human beings, other threats to citizens. And this has a double effect. It gives the terrorist threat a clear primacy over other threats, but it also separates terrorist violence from its connections with other forms of violence. So be they direct violence or structural violence, and it cuts off non-state terrorist violence in particular from any state violence that may surround it. It isolates this one single form of violence and this one single threat. What matters is the countering, not how terrorism came about or what it is linked to, but how to stop it. And that becomes the overriding logic, at least I would argue. And I'll give an example which for me was quite striking. So I had a conversation, and it was a sort of a social moment, and we were having a conversation with mainly people who work in counterterrorism for states and for international organizations. And this was about a year ago. And we were talking about whether Daesh or ISIS would be sending its operatives via the refugee route, whether this was a credible threat. And the general argument was that most likely, and the general agreement was that ISIS and Daesh would most likely be bribing border control and sending their operatives in far safer ways. Why risk a good operative on a dinghy going from Bodrum to Lesbos? That's a silly way of risking an operative's life. You get him a false passport, you get him on a plane, or you bribe border and you get them in a car that's going to get them across the borders. Okay? This was the general argument being made. But then someone said, yes, but there is a risk. So there is a risk of radicalization in the camps because people are being treated so poorly. People are being made feel that they are so unwelcome that there is a risk within the camp of radicalization. So even though there is no threat now, because of what we are doing, there is a potential threat, and therefore we need to treat them as a threat. The logic was extraordinary, because this group of refugees was becoming a threat even though they're not a threat, and they were becoming a threat because of the actions that we are taking. But that was disregarded, and what mattered was that in the end, this group of people became a threat. And that counterterrorism logic overrode everything else. And this is just one example, but for me it was incredibly telling. Let's look at the other side. Let's look at the human security logic. So from a human security logic, terrorism is often presented as a relatively minor threat. And in terms of mortality, indeed, it is a relatively minor threat. From the human security logic, it tends to be seen as something that is amplified by the state for a variety of reasons. To rally support in times of crisis, be it economic or otherwise, and to other causes of serious human insecurity, and to deflect attention from state failure in addressing these crises and insecurity. Importantly, terrorism is seen as a symptom of human insecurity, and overall, one of moderate significance if it weren't for the attention that states give to it. So we're thus left with this really difficult way of seeing, and sort of, I find it a politically and ethically difficult way of understanding this relationship, where either you focus on terrorism, which leads to high levels of fear but kills few, with a counterterrorism logic which overrides a human security logic, or you focus on the silent killers that most forget to fear, and this is the human security logic that asks us to ignore the small danger but extremely powerful fear that terrorism generates and focus on human security. Now, I would argue that we actually need to move away from these two logics, and we need to think about landscapes of violence. We need to think about these two logics coming together under an understanding of conflict. And it opens up a lot of different ways of looking at this. And it may seem like, purely abstract and a little sort of trick, but I want to come back then to the refugee question and how it can have serious implications in terms of what we do on the ground. And it also may not seem as something that new. I mean, we've been talking about conflict language for a very long time, but I was on the train over here and I see that Guns N' Roses have a revival tour, so apparently everything's going these days. So the conflict logic, what do I mean by the conflict logic? Using a conflict logic, we actually not only can bring these two logics together, but we have to do it. We cannot understand terrorism as disconnected from the other forms of violence around it. And we cannot understand human insecurity without also understanding terrorism, because terrorism is also part of what leads people to be and feel insecure. So the state and non-state direct violence, as well as structural violence, meted out by public and private actors, fill this geography and become inextricably linked one to the other. Not only does the language of conflict allow us to understand these forms of violence at the same time, it actually presents them as only capable of being understood in relation to each other. And for me, this sort of image really shows it quite well. I mean, you cannot understand the red without the yellow, without what's underneath it. It's intrinsically part of the same landscape. So none of the logics supersede the other. They can only be understood in connection with each other. Now, this does not deny a choice. We still have a choice of what to focus on. And I think politically, a lot of us feel the need to make that choice. Some of us will be more inclined to focus on law and order. Some of us will be more inclined to focus on inequality. It's part of the landscape of policy and academics that we have. And that choice remains, and I think it's important that that choice remains. So how does it remain? It remains in the conflict management, conflict resolution, and conflict transformation perspectives. And those are three different perspectives that will focus on three different aspects. So some will still focus on the direct terrorist violence in the belief that it is the gravest threat facing the state and thus the citizens of the state. These people will most likely choose a conflict management lens that sees direct violence as the primary source of insecurity that needs to be curbed, at least curbed first. So a conflict management perspective will look at the direct violence first, but will still understand that as part of this landscape, and only understandable as part of this landscape. Others will take a conflict resolution approach, arguing that both direct and structural violence have to be addressed at the same time. So you address the direct violence to reduce tensions, but you also address the underlying factors, because doing one without the other is absolutely useless from a conflict resolution perspective. There is no prioritization of one over the other, but rather the belief that coming together, we can actually address this problem more effectively. And finally, you would have a conflict transformation perspective that would focus largely on how threats are constructed by people in power, by power structures, and what are the power inequalities that are sustained behind these constructions. It would focus more on structural violence and see terrorist violence as the tip of the iceberg that can't be ignored, but really is not the essential part of what we're dealing with. So these three different approaches still give us the choice of what we want to focus on. It's a choice I would argue we need to keep. But it brings violence, it brings counterterrorism, human security in a single landscape, and that needs to be addressed at the same time. So what do I mean in practice by this? To come back to the refugees and the camps. From a conflict perspective, whether it is conflict management, conflict resolution, or conflict transformation, the question of the camps and the refugees living in it becomes a conflict prevention question. It is not a question of whether the refugees are a terrorist threat or only of how to improve conditions in the camp to improve their human security. So we don't have the CT people going in and looking at who is a threat and what is a threat and how to stop it, and the humanitarians and the human security people going in and saying, how can we improve conditions? We have a joint approach that is saying we have to reduce the levels of conflict for everybody, the people inside the camps and the people outside the camps. What this means is that it connects the assumed threat of terrorism with the conditions in the camp, with any radicalizing elements that would need to be isolated or at least countered and discredited. It connects it with how the host countries and the West more broadly is perceived within the camp and how such perceptions can be improved. A conflict frame forces the various states and international agencies to work together to build a unified strategy to prevent or reduce conflict rather than have these two separate focuses, and allows that both the politicization of the camp but also the material and social needs of the refugees are addressed at the same time as part of the same equation. That's me.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Arturo Laurent. He's Program Officer for Terrorism Prevention Branch at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And Arturo's paper is the International Framework on Countering Terrorism and Human Rights Standards.
Thank you. First of all, and on behalf of the Terrorism Prevention Branch of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, our appreciation to the organizers and for the invitation to the branch, Trends, ICSR, and the Orfalea Center, and of course our hosts, King's College, Department of War Studies. I would like to, and actually thanks to David and Harmonie this morning, my job, I think, has made easier. I will start by giving a general perspective of what the Terrorism Prevention Branch does in terms of preventing terrorism. I would describe it as the leading agency or body at the UN level dealing precisely with preventing and countering terrorism. I do cover the Middle East region with a specific focus on Jordan and Afghanistan. I've been involved with the program, leading the program for Afghanistan on these issues. And the Terrorism Prevention Branch, basically what it does is at the legal level provide technical assistance to states, member states, on request to provide this assistance, technical assistance and capacity building in order to facilitate the adoption and the implementation of the international legal framework on countering terrorism. I will try very briefly, before going to the debate and discussion, but I will briefly try to show how the aspects of human rights are embedded in every single international instrument one way or another. Not only in CT international instruments, but also now linked or these cross-cutting issues regarding terrorism, organized crime, and another humanitarian law was being mentioned as well this morning. I would say from a practical level that I completely echo the comments from Harmonie. There's this interlink in which they are mutually reinforcing, preventing or countering terrorism and international human rights standards. And actually, basically, most of the instruments in international law that have been adopted, there's 19 international instruments dealing with terrorism. The last one adopted by the international community in 2014, introducing some amendments to the first instrument on dealing with issues on terrorism, the 1963 Tokyo Convention. There's 19 instruments now, 16 of them in force, 3 the Beijing conventions from 2010, and this 2014 instrument still pending from entering into force. But there's also a myriad of documents from the General Assembly and the Security Council dealing with terrorism. 2001, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373, adopted in a record time after 9/11, introducing more or less the whole international framework at that stage to deal with terrorism. So basically what I will try to do very, very briefly is present this international framework, narrowing it down to the General Assembly and Security Council resolutions, and then the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. Then some basic principles and sources of human rights law, how it's linked to countering terrorism, touching upon victimology, a little bit on monitoring very briefly, and then cooperation. Just the scale of what's going on, and this morning David was mentioning that it was more likely for me to be struck by lightning in London than 20. These are the statistics of the Global Terrorism Index report. For 2016, over 29,000 fatal casualties, the second worst year since these records began, with 2 groups responsible for 74% of the deaths: ISIL, Boko Haram, Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. 72% of these casualties occur in 5 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Syria. And over 90% of terrorist attacks from the period 1989 to 2014 in countries with high levels of human rights violations, for example, torture, imprisonment with no trial, or involving national international conflict. The primary target of terrorism has consistently been private property and civilians, and affecting people of distinction of races, ethnicities, religious beliefs. This puts into context the severity and the gravity of the problem. From a human rights perspective, as I was saying, mutually reinforcing and not in conflict with each other, the CT framework and human rights. And there are three aspects that mainly most of the international instruments adopted make reference to. One is that every measure has to be adopted in compliance with international human rights standards. The second one, making reference also to the obligations of states regarding international humanitarian law. And the third aspect, showing how there are many cross-cutting issues, also in compliance with refugee law. From a human rights perspective, the foundation, obviously the UN Charter and the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with a core set of 18 documents dealing one way or another with human rights. And this is just an example of what could be considered the most emblematic ones: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But many, this is just an example of the instruments. Thematically, the areas covered have an impact on the administration of justice, protection of persons in detention or imprisonment, making reference to what David was mentioning this morning, the aspect of radicalization taking place in prisons, for example, or VEOs, violent extremist offenders. Now more and more part of the discourse at the international level in how to best address, prevent and counter terrorism-related offenses. Rights of indigenous peoples and minorities, discrimination, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, rights of migrants, nationality, statelessness, right to health, work, also addressing from the human rights perspective, genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and also IHL, prisoners of war, civilians, wounded, victims. David was mentioning this morning areas of conflict, what should be applied or what framework should be applied. That is something that I believe I think the international community will still be touching upon and addressing in the next few years. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2195 from 2014 was adopted, basically being one of the first instruments making a specific reference to the links and the nexus between organized crime, transnational organized crime, and terrorism. So watch this space. At the regional level, a myriad of instruments: the African Charter, American Convention, European Convention, the Arab Charter, and other instruments that are being applied to enforce and to strengthen and to promote compliance with international obligations on human rights. Narrowing it down a little bit, United Nations General Assembly resolutions, you can see from 1993, acts of terrorism are activities aimed at the destruction of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democracy, undermining pluralistic civil society, and calling states to be very mindful and careful in terms of complying with their obligations on this area. In 2005, another examples, states must ensure measures to combat terrorism are human rights compliant. Raises the issue of the impact of terrorism in victims, the whole framework of victimology taking upon a new dimension, and other issues for example, to respect non-refoulement obligations by states in terms of extradition mainly, when there's the risk of human rights violations, the person being at risk of human rights violations if extradited. Security Council resolutions 1624 and 1904 from 2009, you can see there basically reaffirming the necessity, the importance of complying with human rights. And these are just examples of the documents, but mainly any other document that you go through at one point or another, whether at the preambular level or operative paragraphs, the emphasis and the reassurance of being compliant with human rights standards will be identified. And as I said, also humanitarian law and refugee law related. From the UN perspective, in 2006, the UN strategy to counter terrorism was adopted. This strategy was reviewed 10 years later, this year, around June, July, approximately, yeah, at that time. It was endorsed, again, with not many changes, I have to say. And this strategy has 4 pillars. The first one is to ensure human rights compliance, adopt and implement human rights. The pillar 4 is basically to ensure human rights compliance, adopt and implement human rights instruments, develop and maintain an effective and rule of law based national criminal justice system. And this goes from the stage of prevention, investigation, prosecution, and adjudication. And then even subsequently, sentencing and the conditions of serving any sentence in the spirit of a social readaptation and preventing radicalization. From a treaty, from an international law perspective, well, the obligations stem from a treaty law binding on those states that have ratified. UN Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7, non-negotiable, the obligations are clear. Going back a little bit to customary law and parentary norms like the ones that I was mentioning, the prohibition of torture, slavery, genocide, racial discrimination, crimes against humanity. However, as it was also mentioned this morning, there is a possibility in which some of these rights may be limited or restricted under certain circumstances in order to facilitate the prevention, investigation, prosecution, and adjudication of terrorism-related offenses. As you know, there is no consensus or a final definition of terrorism adopted by the international community. It's up to each individual state to agree on its own definition at the national level. However, in terms of human rights and the hundreds of specific offenses that are contained in all these 19th instruments and the Security Council resolutions, well, in adopting those and in going through the criminal process from beginning to end, human rights standards have to be complied with. The general principles, there's no crime without with an offense that has been adopted prior to the act. This is one of the reasons why it is so important for states to adopt and to incorporate into domestic law the offenses that are prescribed by these international instruments. One example, Resolution 2178 from 2014, Security Council Resolution on Foreign Terrorist Fighters. Operative Paragraph 6, Paras A, B, and C, making reference to the offenses that will be involving the movement, facilitating, going from one state to another to join a specific conflict, facilitating or sponsoring. Very specific offenses in view of the increasing number of individuals going to conflict areas. More than 100 nationalities represented. Now, some statistics talking about 30,000, some statistics put that number even higher, of foreign terrorist fighters. It is essential for states to incorporate these offenses, since no consensuated final definition of terrorism is there. All the other offenses, if adopted, will facilitate many areas impacting on not only human rights, but international cooperation, for example, and we'll see very briefly on this. As a lawyer, as a criminal lawyer, always important to highlight for me human rights regarding fair trial. Presumption of innocence, double jeopardy, non bis in idem, non-discrimination, equality of arms, competent and independent impartial courts, and rights against self-incrimination and right to silence. Fair trial rights, well, other fair trial guarantees related to this are no special courts, trial without undue delay, no trials in absentia, appeal and review mechanisms, the juvenile system, and compensation for miscarriages of justice, or for that matter, the compensation or addressing the support and protection of victims of acts of terrorism via a restitution or a compensation systems. Going very briefly to the cases in which legitimate limitations can be imposed, well, these rights that you see at the bottom are not absolute. Some limitations can be imposed under certain circumstances: protection of national security, maintaining public order, health issues, and counter-terrorism. So the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, assembly, and freedom of movement, especially now in view, for example, of some of the offenses that states are required to incorporate into the domestic systems. Movement, how to prevent movement of individuals that we think, as law enforcement agencies, we think are going from point A to point B as in a conflict area. Could we withdraw passports? Any other travel document? Some administrative measures have been talked about, like also withdrawing nationality, a secondary nationality. Not the first one. We cannot leave anybody stateless. And derogable, then we jump to derogable rights and non-derogable rights: the right to life, prohibition of torture, prohibition of imprisonment for failure to pay contractual obligations. But you see there at the bottom that under this general comment of the Human Rights Committee, fundamental requirements of fair trial are considered to be non-derogable. So for those practicing lawyers out there, a tick highlighting this situation. Very, very briefly, because I've been given my first notice. Requirements for derogation, public emergency, they have to be done in conformity with international obligations. Derogation must not be inconsistent with other obligations, including those of international humanitarian law and peremptory norms. They have to be proportional. There has to be a strict necessity, a specific duration. They have to be temporary, not indefinite. A geographical area specifically mentioned, and the scope. Mentioned this morning, just very briefly, special investigative techniques. The United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime includes special investigative techniques. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption includes or makes reference to that. Control delivery, covert surveillance, informants, undercover operations, all these mechanisms are available. However, states have to be compliant with human rights standards. And here we see the definition of special investigative techniques. Interestingly, the UNTOC Convention does not define special investigative techniques as such, or UNCAC, the Convention Against Corruption. I will just, 1 minute, I will just very briefly touch upon, and just trying to generate some debate and discussion for the next stage. Consular assistance, case law, Mexico v. the US, the obligation of the state to notify the consular of the nationality of the arrested person. 50 cases or so were brought to the International Court, and the decision was that all proceedings had to be restored. Just mentioning how important this obligation, according to the Convention on Consular Relations, imposed by the Convention on Consular Relations, is. A prohibition of the use of statements obtained under torture, and prohibition of inhuman and degrading treatment, and the obligation to comply with medical examinations of detainees. How important are the obligations on human rights? Conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism include human rights violations and lack of rule of law. National effective criminal law and counterterrorism frameworks in compliance with international human rights standards are not conflicting, but complementary and reinforcing. The importance of adopting the international framework by member states, it's of the essence in order to facilitate international cooperation and facilitate other aspects like extradition, mutual legal assistance, transfer of prisoners, recognition of sentences by national courts of another state, and else. So you can see, and just to conclude now, you can see all these cross-cutting issues touching upon many of the areas. It's not CT aspects only. Now there's connotations of transnational organized crime, human rights, humanitarian law, and else. So trying very briefly to present the international framework, and maybe we can discuss further for the remainder of the session.
Thank you. Okay, so I think you've all heard we have some points of contention and we have some points of overlap, and I'm please open to the floor for questions. Yes, please.
I'd just like to ask a question about the UN conventions, and it's, although I'm largely referring to gangster regimes run by psychopathic egomaniacs. We all know who those states are, and some of them are on the Security Council. I also refer to the fact that there are 50 cases Mexico has brought against the US for lack of consular assistance, including, I understand, capital cases. And I remember some years ago when I was at the Alamo in Texas, I saw very dramatically two starkly different societies culturally. Is it fair to say that gangster regimes pay no attention whatsoever. And the failure often of the United States, which is not a gangster society and government, doesn't help make that better. Thank you. I'm sorry, I just see no evidence whatsoever that countries like Russia and China are going to pay any attention whatsoever. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, my name's Jeffrey Harris. I get my bite of the cherry tomorrow, but it's this whole conference so far has been extremely rich. But a couple of questions, following on a little bit from the question over there. You've given us, I speak as a former official of the European Union. I'm used to the difference between what's written on the paper and what is there in reality. And, you know, what you're saying about lip service can also apply in so many of these issues. But you referred historically to the development of international humanitarian law, right, from 1948 onwards. Would it be unfair to say that actually in 2016, partly as a response to terrorism, but for a whole lot of other reasons, there is actually a sea change which really is going to fatally undermine what had been a very strongly developing project of international humanitarian law? I speak as somebody who worked on this within the European Parliament, which obviously supports all this as a matter of... But, for example, what is happening now with the International Criminal Court? South Africa, young people, we march through the streets around here in favor of Nelson Mandela, and here we are with what's happening in South Africa. You mentioned, or the previous questioner drew attention to the fact that the Security Council, in particular its 5 permanent members, will contain representatives of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump, the 3. The other 2, being France and Britain, will have possibly, if Mr. Fillon is elected, leaders who are openly sceptical even about the European Convention on Human Rights, which was one of the pillars on which this whole structure has been built up, at least in the European context. So living inside the UN system, would you detect a sea change? Of course, officials within any institution cling to their jobs, I don't mean in professional sense, but to their ideals, what they work for, as I do, having worked in the European Union. But do you feel a sea change taking place? Then I think the way you posited these issues as false choices, people, whether it's Ken Roth or Donald Trump down the street from each other in New York City, speaking supposedly, paying lip service of respect because we're the great America, we're a free country, or vice versa. Whereas in reality, what is lacking is a balanced discussion of both the issues, because, as you rightly said, the choices are often rather false because lack of law can feed terrorism. It's not a question of, using the kind of words about bombing people the way that Trump uses it or others in the past. But isn't there a problem, since we're here in London in 2016, that democracy makes it extremely difficult for citizens, let alone leaders, to handle things without presenting them as a binary choice? If you're not for us, you're against us. Even poor old Teresa, I know this is online, but I'm not looking for a job in the British government. She's sort of, I'm in favour of the EU, but I'm against the European Convention on Human Rights. Getting into a whole sort of intellectual, legal confusion, not because she's a bad person, because she's trying to present things in a way which brings together the issues. She no doubt believes in freedom and human rights, and she believes in effective counter-terrorism. Isn't there a way that the fact that democratic politics, which forces us to make choices, prevents a sort of serious, balanced discussion? And isn't that rather dangerous, given the nature of what we're talking about?
Okay, which of you would like to go first? Arturo?
State compliance, always an issue. One of the things that not only the Terrorism Prevention Branch, but other agencies and bodies within the UN system aim to achieve is universal adoption of the instruments or documents that are adopted in a context or a framework of negotiations. I was a diplomat a few years ago, and I had the opportunity to see that aspect from sitting on the floor. And now I have the opportunity and the privilege to see the process from the other side. It's not easy. There's a beautiful introduction to the Rome Statute that was negotiated from around 1998, adopted a few years later, talking about the mosaic of systems and legal traditions and cultures that the document was trying to put together. At that time, when the Rome Statute was being negotiated, terrorism was not included as an international offense. I think it's more an offense that has transnational connotations. But this goes to show that how difficult it is for a certain system like the one regarding CT, counterterrorism, talking about 19th instruments and a series of Security Council resolutions, to be universally implemented. I always say when I am providing technical assistance to member states, I always say that harmonizing national law with international standards has always needs to be done always from a perspective of taking into account the national system, the national legal tradition, and many other aspects. So basically, international law tries to put together a series of principles or standards in many areas that need to be adopted by over close to 200 member states, 190 something. So it's not an easy process. In terms of human rights violations, all I could say is that there are the systems within the system to highlight these situations. Within the UN system, we have the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that has a monitoring system. And then we have, for each instrument, human rights bodies that will monitor. We face the problem that most of them won't be enforceable. We'll just have the status of a recommendation being done. However, within the General Assembly and the Security Council, there are also mechanisms that can other states can bring to the attention of the floor to try to address and to try to correct and to try to promote compliance with human rights. International humanitarian law, human rights. It was very interesting a couple of years ago when Resolution 2195 was adopted, talking about this nexus with between terrorism and organized crime. And then also other resolutions starting to put emphasis on not only compliance with human rights standards, but humanitarian law. And then we have the ICC. And then we have a practical challenge for the ICC now, not only with South Africa, but other countries that have taken the decision to withdraw. So I think that the ICC will face, in terms of setting its credibility and as an institution, as a judicial body at the international level, will face important challenges from now on. It's always been a problem. 2017 is the year in which the offense of aggression would be coming into force under the to be part of the jurisdiction of the ICC. That was a milestone that took years of negotiation after no definition was adopted in 1998. So we'll see what happens. Whether one regime or the other, and as terrorism, as a criminal offense with transnational implications, more likely than not, the human rights body of international law would be applicable. The situation obviously is that there are areas of conflict that probably it goes beyond terrorism and falls in a different category, but we'll see. We'll have to follow track and how the international community adapts.
International community is not a concept, it's people. People, in some cases elected, some people in power for a whole lot of reasons, or sometimes a combination of the two. And it seems to me that within the leadership of that international community, there is a sea change against all the wonderful work which the United Nations and the Council of Europe, for that matter, stands for. That was what, but still, this is probably the theme of our conference. I don't think you can really be expected to answer it, but I personally detect a cold wind blowing in our face, as it were.
Harmonie?
I think the question of democracy and whether democracy forces the framing in such stark sort of binaries is an interesting one. I mean, on one side, I can see the argument that we because of the speed with which we are used to new headlines, we're used to new interest, we have to fill this void constantly, and therefore it has to be exciting. And to be exciting, we have to have a conflict. And to have a conflict, it has to be either security or freedom. And that makes it all the more interesting for the public. And I can understand that argument. At the same time, I think that when states want to see complexity, they see complexity. And when they want to present things in binary ways, they present things in binary ways. So it is a political choice. I mean, if you think of Northern Ireland, let's go back to Northern Ireland. For a very long time, the British government and the British state said there was no such thing as a Republican activist. You were either a member of the IRA or you weren't. And that was, it was a clear this distinction that had to be made. And then when negotiating started and when things changed, all of a sudden, well, you could be Republican, and it didn't really matter what that meant. So there was an acceptance that there was a whole fluid group of people that sort of went in and out of violence and non-violence and the IRA and Sinn Féin, and that it was an incredibly complex landscape. But that came, with time it was accepted. So I think there is also a clear decision on the part of policymakers to either construct binaries or to reject them and accept fluidity and complexity. I think that it is a choice.
Yes. Went to say, well, yeah.
I'm going to follow this up, actually, because I think in a way it relates to the earlier discussion that Professor Ormond raised to do. In fact, he went to the past, 1922, and Ireland, partition of Ireland. And in a way, Irish issue actually relates to the concerns, our contemporary concerns, in the sense that there was an Irish diaspora, meaning Irish migrant communities who had gone to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, South Africa. These are very important issues. And in fact, these people, these migrants, actually became the backbone of the Irish Republican movement. It's important to remember that De la Vera himself was a Mexican-Irish person. His father was was a Mexican, Spanish person, born in Mexico. And his mother was an Irish woman, a migrant. So what I'm really getting at is this, that the Irish Republican movement, its antecedents are amongst the people who went abroad and remembered that their country needed to be freed from the British colonialism. I mention all this because, in a way, what happened in the 1990s when Britain finally decided to go for peace process between the two peoples. Actually, it wasn't just an issue of security services helping to foil the Irish Republicans or the IRA. It had another element, actually, which was very, very important, which was a societal thing, which is that actually these two communities, the Irish Catholics and the settler Protestant communities, were actually living apartheid lives, separate lives. The dominant community, the Protestant community, actually treated the Irish Catholics as a bit like South Africa, actually. They were the blacks in the South African context. And these people obviously dreamt the dream of an Irish Republican nation, but also that what actually changed with the British government's realization that actually the only way we can overcome this conflict is by enabling the Irish Catholics to rise up economically. And Britain pumped hundreds of millions of pounds to try and create a balance between the Catholics and Protestants. For example, one of the other things was legislative change. So, for example, the police service was changed, employment, discrimination laws were brought in. All that stuff was very important. The reason I mention all this is that, we can talk about security issues, but it's also to do with the way the world economic system is framed as well, and how we perhaps engage with dissent, not just by treating it as a security issue, but as a human issue as well, how we deal with human beings. Laws themselves will not help us fight Islamist terrorism. We also need to use the human element, the economic tools in our apparatus. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And there were two quick hands went up immediately. So first, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much. One of the difficulties, of course, the implementation of these conventions. And I think this is the lack of enforcement may make sometimes meaningless this convention which you talk about. I was recently for a research in the Kurdish area in Turkey. I was shocked to see the violence, state violence, and sometimes some villages, some town was whipped out from the map. And I remember also the UN High Commissioner Hussein stated that is talking about extrajudicial killing of the Kurds. But at the end of the day, didn't happen anything within the UN. I think one of the main issues is that is the states talking, but there is non-state actors that they can talk on behalf of themselves within the UN.
And a quick comment, I think. Is that?
Yeah, it's really, thank you, a response to the gentleman's point about the Irish situation. What I'm going to say is very uncomfortable, but I think we have to factor it in because I think it is a relevant, although disturbing factor in how conflicts end. That one very significant factor in the late 80s and early 90s was that the casualty ratio was very different from the 20 years before. The Protestants were firing back and the Catholics were taking heavy casualties. I will pay £250,000 to a charity of the choice of anyone in this room if they can arrange a written denial from a cardinal in Ireland of the allegation that a serving priest in the early 70s was involved in an IRA attack which killed 8 civilians, including children. I made that offer publicly to Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, but at £25,000, he ducked the offer, saying he'd never discussed this issue with his colleagues. If anybody wants to further the cause of peace and make a donation, £250,000, and over lunchtime, I can prove I have liquid funds. It's not a nice thing I've said. It's not a nice thing I've said, but I think to be realistic, we have to understand these disturbing and inconvenient facts. Thank you.
Give the panelists a chance to...
Just briefly, the issue of non-compliance. For starters, the obligations imposed by the conventions are obligations imposed on those states that have signed and ratified. And as we know, there's now been examples of signatures being withdrawn, for example. Probably even more and more. I think one of the first cases was when the U.S. withdrew the signature of the ICC statute. They were not going to ratify. The position was that they were not going to ratify, and they withdrew them. But now there's cases in which, in the context of countering narcotics, for example, some of the conventions, drug-related conventions, states get out and then come back with a reservation, for example. Now, in terms of human rights and in terms of monitoring, as I said, excuse me, there are some mechanisms. Under the UN system, there's the Human Rights Council, which is an intergovernmental body, then human rights treaty bodies, depending on each convention, and the Office of the High Commissioner. But in the end, it's international law is international law. International law depends mainly on the support by individual states, and then on the support from the community as a whole, or the pressure that the community as a whole. I agree, there was a comment, I think that, well, the community is not the community, but it's the actual individuals. I probably would also suggest that policies are can be changed by individuals, but in the end, it's the membership at the state level. I've been over 25 years now in the public sector in different jurisdictions, and people come and go. But it's the institutional perspective or the institutional side that also is important, I think. I do understand and I do know that obviously the policy may depend on who's, but there's also a factor in which international law, since the beginning of times, it's the pressure of the community as a whole in terms of moving in one direction or another, and it may take some time. International criminal law has evolved in the last 50 years more than it evolved in the previous 500, and still is evolving, and still there's new challenges that international criminal law will be facing, and it may or may not succeed. There's other things that are being done in terms of moving in the right direction. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon, for those of you who are interested in the challenges of the definition, a consensuated definition on terrorism, well, under the guidance, going to that link of the individual and the institutional side, the STL drafted a definition of terrorism, mainly guided by the work of Cassesi, which would be very interesting. It's very interesting and would be interesting for those of you to take a look at. But what I'm trying to say is that yes, institutions move guided by individuals in terms of policy, but it's also an institutional side. No? So
I've been given a signal that we only have a couple of minutes, and so I want to bring the question back to Harmonie in terms of and I'll give you a response, but I want to just interject one thing in terms before you do your response, and that is while I'm very sympathetic to your argument from a scholarly standpoint of interpreting conflict and avoiding the what you call the fruitless search. I'm wondering from a political standpoint and in terms of democracy and rights, if abandoning the conflict is actually a useful thing to do. That one of the powers of democracy and of democratic states within the community is when they behave well, but democratic states vis-a-vis their populations is the power of that conflict. And if we abandon the struggle for human rights in terms of the state's pursuit of any policy, whether it's counterterrorism or education, don't we give up a great deal more than we're going to get from the interpretation?
My concern with the way that the human security and human rights argument is framed, when it's framed on counterterrorism policy, is that it has a tendency, though that's not always the case, but there is a tendency of saying, of minimizing to quite an extreme what at least is the widespread fear of terrorism. So whether it's founded or unfounded to a certain degree is not that relevant. What's relevant is that there are many, many people out there that are very scared of dying in a terrorist attack. And so it is affecting people's lives. And I think there's a tendency in the human rights world of not taking that into account enough in terms of the rhetoric. So if the human rights and the human security logic was able to incorporate that more and to accept that there is a genuine fear in people, which is stoked by governments and stoked by radical groups and stoked by the worst kind of media and stoked by a whole group of forces that come together to stoke it, but still is there and is affecting people and making people fearful, which is a form of violence in and of itself. You're living in fear is living under violence in many ways. I think that just needs to take a little bit more ground, but I do understand that the risk of giving up on the human rights logic or the human security logic, then to a certain degree allows a free passage for some of the worst kinds of abuses, I think. But can I finish on the Northern Ireland really briefly, just because we've spoken about it in very, very different ways. What I find interesting about in the end of Northern Ireland is that from a counterterrorism perspective, it's over. It's not really an issue anymore. I mean, it's way below the acceptable levels of violence, if we were to use that kind of language. It doesn't really affect people's lives that much. From a human security perspective, the indicators are improving and continuously improving, in both communities to a certain degree. From a conflict perspective, it's still a real problem. I mean, the peace walls are higher than they've ever been. So the segregation between communities, particularly working class Catholic and working class Protestant communities, is incredibly high. Schools have not desegregated as quickly as anyone hoped they would. There are people, and many people. Intense communities that can spend until the age of 18 without ever really interacting from a member of the other community. From a conflict perspective, it's incredibly problematic. So you throw in something like Brexit in the middle of it, and all of a sudden everyone gets very, very nervous again. So I think, again, a conflict framework, which has been used in Northern Ireland to be fair, because, the joke in Belfast is if you trip, you're tripping over a conflict analyst, or a conflict researcher. Is useful again, and possibly more useful than the two others, I would say. So I thought I'd come back to my point.
Hey, I'm going to have to bring this session to a close. I want to thank our two panelists for a very stimulating conversation, and thank the audience.